Welcome to Business Talk with me, Michael Avery, where we're wading through the detritus of our plastics problem. And it's more than just litter. Waste plastic has become an issue of global concern. It's highly visible as an environmental pollutant, but the science does show us that to reduce the impact of plastic on the environment, we need to look at immediate implementation of various strategies that include things like reduction, substitution where it makes sense to do so, and also improved waste management and also the growth of downstream mechanical recycling. There is no single silver bullet to solve the plastic problem. And to talk about this, I'm joined now by David Drew, who's a Sustainability Director for Africa at Coca-Cola, and someone who's got a long professional journey in the sustainability space. So David, great to have you on the show. And we're talking really now about an issue that I think is quite an emotive issue for many people. And we know South Africa needs a cohesive treaty, so to speak, on plastic pollution, something that unites government, that unites companies and consumers around clear targets. But what does a treaty look like? Because a treaty to me also sounds like something, unfortunately, that can be easily broken.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think there've been a lot of, let's say, terminologies for kind of what we need. I think, one of the probably the most common one that people talk about is something which has become known as the Plastics Pact, which is essentially a voluntary, almost code of conduct for plastics users, and that sort of came out of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. But it's not the only one. But essentially, what it's doing is trying to say, can we do two things? Can we voluntarily get big business to agree to a set of standards and a set of rules that are going to make a meaningful difference? And can those, let's say, that pioneering adoption ultimately then start to influence policy? So a lot of what we see coming out of things like PACT is beginning to inform policy that we would see in places like the EU, which is probably the furthest down the track of actually making sort of hard and fast rules. And essentially, it really starts around things like, what should we be using and what shouldn't we be using? And the Pact is a great example because it starts with a sort of fundamental principle, which is if something is not recyclable, then it's a problem. So the first thing is everything should be recyclable. So that's their kind of first target. And actually in plastics, I think that's one of probably the biggest issues we have to deal with, because there's so much of what we do. And obviously, as someone who's involved in it and been in the plastics industry for a long time, I'm probably in the unfortunate position of knowing what can and can't be recycled. So when my wife and son say to me, "Dad, can I put this in the recycling?" and I say no, they go, "Oh, why not?" And looking at what I throw in the bin versus what I put in the recycling, as someone who's probably better informed than most, it still gets to me that I went to the shop yesterday and could choose. I didn't buy them, but I could still buy plastic earbuds. So, those are the kind of things that through PACT have said, what, we really don't need these items that can't be recycled. They can be replaced by other things. And so that's the kind of thing that you'll see as a voluntary sort of leadership by example type thing. Because I think you're right. As soon as you try and make it regulated, you're going to have people who won't comply. And I think what's interesting for me is that even in places where you do have regulation, you still have non-compliance. And I think you almost have to take that on board and go, I'm not everyone else's policeman. I must be compliant. I can't stop the person next to me driving in the emergency lane when we're stuck in a traffic jam. I can get irritated by it, but I'm not a policeman and I can't stop it. So it's kind of that view that, do right for yourself. And I think that's why PACT can make an impact, and things that are voluntary have a place as much as let's say, called hard and fast regulation.
And you mentioned the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. It's really about improving the design of plastic products so that you've got that greater circularity at end of life. And I think really an important starting point if you are going to address this. I'm always loath to impose top-down regulation for the points that you've just mentioned, but it's a very important conversation to continue having to allow South Africa to transition into sustainable alternatives to stop plastic pollution. How loud is that conversation on the dial if, say, it was 1 decade ago, and how do we turn that volume up?
So, I started in the plastics industry in early 2000s. So kind of been through that decade, if you want to sort of think about it that way. And I can tell you, it's at a completely different level to what it was then. I wouldn't say that there was nothing then. And I think it's important, if you cast your mind back, it's important to remember that the first plastic bag tax actually started, I think, in the early 2000s. So, it's hard to imagine that there was nothing, but I would certainly say there's a lot more today. And I think that maybe at that point there was some threat of government regulation, maybe along the lines of what we saw in HDPE plastic bags. But now I would say that there's a far more consumer awareness. And I would say that we are, as a country, we are still relatively sort of early in that transition. But, in my job, I look after the whole of Africa. And so I see very diverse views across Africa. And then I contrast it with my colleagues in Europe or in Japan or somewhere like that, where they are just, they're on the next level. And so I think there's a continuum. We have markets in which people are very passionate about it and activists are very active. People are worried about collection and recycling. And in others, we have almost disinterest from governments and from society. So I think South Africa is somewhere in the middle. Certainly it's increasing, but certainly has a long way to go. And I think, what's interesting is you always find this gap between people say they're interested in environmental issues and they're concerned about them. But then the question is, will it affect their choices when it comes to what they buy? Will it affect their behavior in terms of what they do? And I think that's probably the gap that we have. So we have kind of an awareness that's growing, but we don't really have that entrenched, hardcore sort of consumerism that is driving the kind of changes we see in many other markets, because people vote with their pocket, as it were.
And it's that'll end up driving the decision by the brand owner and the retailer to start adapting to that consumer choice or preference. So why don't we see more people taking the environment a little bit more seriously, considering there's been this heightened awareness? We're building up to COP26. It's everywhere you look. And after all the evidence to show how damaging that plastic waste can be.
So I honestly believe that part of the problem is that people don't really know what they should and shouldn't be doing. And so I think there's a lot of mixed messages out there. I think that we've got a lot to do in terms of raising awareness and helping people understand. And I think, for one of the things that's coming up in the near future is a discussion about better on-pack labeling, for example, really to help people understand. And one of the questions I've certainly been asked since the day I got involved with PETCO, which is a PET producer responsibility organization about recycling PET, is this kind of idea. Well, I look on the bottom of the bottle and I see the little recycling sign, and therefore I think it's recyclable. But the reality is that unfortunately there's no control over that sign. So people can put it literally on anything, something that's recyclable and something that's non-recyclable. So something like what they call on-pack recycling labeling is a key starting point to say, look, guys, these are the rules. And if your pack doesn't conform, it's not going to get this mark. It's not going to get a green dot, or it's not going to get a "this is recyclable" mark on it. And I think when we start to make the connection between what is recyclable and what isn't, so it's not just my wife and my son being told by an insider, effectively, is that we start to close the gap and people go, I can't believe this is not recyclable. And then perhaps we start to see the behavior change. So I think, closing the gap between what the consumer sees and what they actually touch and what we put on our packaging is a really important sort of bridge builder to maybe change those habits.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always reminded of that phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant in these things. Greater transparency, greater awareness to enable and empower that consumer to make the choice can only be a positive outcome. Now, you're working on a few initiatives as Coca-Cola, and I must say, what I've found as a financial journalist covering the sustainability space, it was really a backwater issue about 15 to 20 years ago. It is now increasingly a strategic issue. We see companies like Safripol, they're not even consumer facing, but they're a polymer business and they understand that they've got to take the lead here. And they've hosted a sustainability summit the last 2 years. So it's been really interesting to see the kind of corporate responsibility. What is the World Without Waste initiative? And what is Coca-Cola doing to drive the mandate locally here in South Africa?
So World Without Waste is our global kind of umbrella sustainable packaging side. Obviously, we have other elements to our sustainability, of course, water and climate, for example. But World Without Waste really covers what we do with our packaging. And essentially, it's built around the Ellen MacArthur Foundation principles. So we have three main goals. The first one is aligned with Ellen MacArthur, is the 100% recyclable. So we have an ambition to make everything that we sell, all our packaging, recyclable by 2025. And to give you an idea, we're already in the high 90s. So, it sounds like a big ask, but as an organization, sorry, that's in Africa, we are already very, very close, which is great. The second is to collect a bottle or can for every one that we sell. Now that obviously is a huge challenge, but as an organization, we've actually been involved in collection of bottles and cans through producer responsibility organizations like Petco, which I've been part of for many years already. And also in some countries, we obviously do it on our own, and that's just more sort of in the absence of anything formal. And the third one is to increase our recycled content. And that's really about recognizing that if you want to collect, you have to have somewhere for your material to go. And therefore, in the case of PET and glass and cans, you create a circular economy by actually insisting that you get that material back in your products, and you reuse it yourself. There are, of course, ways to recycle that aren't circular. So some people refer to them as downcycling, but essentially it's just a non-circular approach, and they're very valuable. But we really can't pull that lever. So in other words, we can't increase the consumption of polyester shirts to collect PET bottles. So what we can do is we can insist on creating a demand for the bottles that we want to see collected by insisting that we include up to 50% recycled content in our PET and our cans and on our glass, and that drives the circular economy. So that's kind of World Without Waste in a nutshell.
And in terms of innovations, and we spoke earlier about circular economy and product design being so important here, and I often look at things like lids on bottles, and I must imagine that can become something of a challenge. What are some of the innovations that Coke is working on in the packaging and bottling space?
So I think probably, as I mentioned, our recyclability is really high, and obviously the way we measure that is, can it be recycled? But we also acknowledge that ultimately, what drives recycling, particularly in countries that rely on informal collection, is what I like to call street value. So in other words, is the material worth something on the street? And that would be, it obviously has a huge impact when you're talking about things like a channel like waste pickers, but it's also relevant even if you're looking at a formal collection system through a Pick It Up or through a Waste Tech or someone like that that's doing the formal collection from your household. Because ultimately, what's collected is sold to offset the cost of collection. And if something doesn't have value, then it isn't sort of preferred, it isn't selected. And so, for example, one of the things we've done on a design side is we've recognized that, to give you an idea, and we've got some great data coming out of a very exciting blockchain-based project at the moment, that green PET has traded at about 58% the value of clear PET through our data set, which we've been monitoring now for over 6 months. So, and it's pretty consistent. And what that means is that it has 58% of the value of clear PET. Now, you can imagine for a waste picker, if you've only got so much space or you only got willing to push something up a hill, the value of the material, you're going to pick a clear bottle over a green bottle any day. So although green bottles can be recycled, we felt that it was very important that a brand as big as Sprite change from green to clear. And that's why you would have seen Sprite transition from a green bottle, which we all sort of grew up with, to the clear bottle that you now found on shelf. So it's not that it wasn't recyclable, but as we're making it more valuable by changing it to clear. And part of that value comes from the fact that it can now become more. Green limits how much can be done with the color. And so by taking the green out, those bottles can now go back into bottle-to-bottle recycling. And as a result of that, they're worth more. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing to sort of tweak the system, and how little changes in product design can really make a big difference on the ground.
That is really remarkable. It's all about incentives, understanding what drives the market and then using those little tweaks and nudges to drive those desired outcomes. And you mentioned earlier that it really should be internalized. This is not a box ticking exercise. And that's why I'd like to hear a little bit more about the Voluntary Extended Producer Program. It's the VEPR model and how we've got the current EPR regulations being implemented in South Africa. The two kind of sound like they dovetail together, but are slightly different. Can you just talk us through the two?
Sure. So voluntary extended producer responsibility, as I said, is something that in South Africa, in fact, we were talking to Collector Can the other day and probably acknowledging that they were probably the first example of voluntary extended producer responsibility in South Africa as late as I think around 1996. So in the early 2000s, the PET industry got together and established an organization called PETCO. And PETCO is a voluntary producer responsibility organization. And over the last sort of now, keep having to update my numbers, like 17 years, PETCO has grown the recycling of PET bottles from about sort of estimated about 14% up to probably a peak just before COVID of sort of mid 60s. COVID obviously knocked it back a bit. But it is recovering again in 2021, which is encouraging. So essentially, voluntary EPR basically meant that as industry, you take responsibility for the product that you sell after use. In other words, after you and I have consumed our beverage or a can or a packet of chips or whatever, we take responsibility to make sure that the right thing happens to it. Now, there can be lots of options, but the question is does it end up in landfill? And essentially, it's about not letting it end up in landfill. And that organization, PETCO, then became a model that was adopted and followed by a number of other producer responsibility organizations for a number of different substrates. And Coke has sort of been involved in those right from the beginning. And essentially, what we're doing now is that those organizations were, let's call it the coalition of the willing, and they were, in some cases, they would represent, for example, in beverages, probably about 80% of the beverage market, but in other materials and other channels, far less. And essentially what happens is that you end up with those that are willing to contribute and those that are kind of happy to let others do it. And essentially, let's call it the voluntary environment effectively starts to run into limits at some point. And that's really because you can only do so much when a certain segment of the market are not paying. And obviously, the more difficult your material is to collect and recycle, the more buy-in you need and the more contributions you need. And so typically what happens kind of in the evolution of what we would call EPR, you start in a situation where what I like to call organic collection and recycling. In other words, it just happens. And it's often driven by the informal sector. It's often driven by the value of the material. And that generally is very selective for high value materials. So PET, HDPE, aluminum cans, they're okay. They kind of start off from nothing. Then you move into the voluntary space where people start to put a little bit of money into the system. And typically that tends to lift the collection and recycling rates up to the kind of rates which I mentioned, the 50, 60, 70% if you're lucky. But to go that next step, you need everyone to contribute. And that's where we are today. So we're a month away now from a transition from voluntary to regulated. And under regulated, essentially all producers, all brand owners, all converters, the whole industry is going to have to come together and put together these plans, or really build on what we've done before, but take it to the next level and to reach targets which are now set by government. We set our own targets for 15 years. We said we want to achieve 70% by, I think it was 2021 or whatever it was, and we came very close. But now we're moving into a situation where those targets are given to us by government. And so for each part of the packaging industry, there are sort of sector-specific targets that now industry organizations will have to work towards. And as I said, it will require broader participation, should bring in more money. But it also now brings in right back to where we started, which was obviously the risk of non-compliance, people not contributing. But effectively that now becomes government's sort of role to be the enforcer and to make sure that everyone is playing their part.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly one way of addressing waste plastic is to grow the demand for it by growing that local end-use market and increasing recycled content in new plastic products. But I think the big challenge, and to your point, has been consistent supply of large volumes of high-quality plastic waste feedstock. So EPR certainly sounds to me like it's looking to solve for that. But there is still a concern that when it comes to the environment, many corporates still see it as a nice to have, a public relations initiative. They're accused of greenwashing. It's a box ticking exercise rather than giving it serious consideration at the boardroom level. Do you see EPR shifting this?
I think it may, but I think probably the bigger change will be the consumer and the public interaction. And I think if you look at those organizations that are taking sustainability and taking waste seriously, it generally hasn't been because of a response to regulation. It has been looking ahead of a perceived, what we refer to internally as a social license to operate. It's really that should you even be allowed to operate and really be a good corporate citizen? And unfortunately, as you say, that's not something that applies to all businesses. It is generally, it's sort of more concentrated in the multinationals where, let's say, you have that paradigm of a very kind of developed Japanese or European market. And so that helps informs your corporate culture. So I think that regulation can certainly raise it, and it certainly has its part. But I almost think that you want to get people to buy in because they believe that it's part of their business journey and really are true to it. Because as soon as it's just a response to regulation, I think you have the risk of what I call malicious compliance. It's kind of, the people that are executing the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law, for example. And I think that what we always try to do is try and show that it's not really about getting away with a minimum. It's really about doing whatever is necessary. And hopefully that can kind of, we can lead from the front in that. And we certainly have some great areas of collaboration. We see, across Africa, we've got some great initiatives like APRA, which is really a coalition of big brand owners working together to help drive this agenda across Africa, and partners like AB InBev, Diageo, Unilever, very much part and parcel of the process as well.
From a consumer perspective, and I'll come back to your earlier point about your family being lucky to have an insider in the house to say, well, what can and can't we recycle? I still find the whole process quite confusing. And, that's coming from someone who considers himself fairly up to date and au fait with recycling trends. What are your personal views on how you recycle and how we play our part as a responsible consumer if we want to?
So I'm always torn because there's if you really want to know what's recyclable, ask a waste picker. And I'm being serious about that because essentially the insight that they have is they have an insight that says this is worth something and this isn't worth something. And it's something that is really important, because something that's technically recyclable, perhaps in Europe, is it recyclable in South Africa? Is there a value chain that's actually going to drive the collection of that thing? So what I do, and obviously I think most of us do, is put things that we think might be recyclable. Some people call it wish cycling. And the bottom line is it's better to separate and put out your recyclables in a bag, whether it's for pick it up in Joburg or for Waste Tech or for whoever else. And if a waste picker were to go through that bag and take stuff and leave stuff behind, so the waste pickers are very, very resourceful. On Wednesday mornings, they're outside my window at sort of early hours, and they'll be picking out the things that are most valuable and leaving the things that are not are less valuable. And go and have a look at what they leave behind, because that's actually what begins to inform, what's recyclable and what's not recyclable. And yes, if you have a pick it up, they will come and collect the leftovers. But a lot of people sort of get upset with the waste pickers and say, I put a whole lot of recycling out and they only took this stuff. And the answer is because that's what's recyclable. And
that's
what you
valuable. David Drew, we're going to end it there. It's been really interesting taking a tour through the world of plastics recycling. And really, it does also start with everyone making that informed choice. And so we do hope that, the on-package labeling movement just continues to grow. And we do see more corporates doing the right thing, not because of some kind of government regulation, but because ultimately it is about that long-term social license. David Drew, Sustainability Director for Africa at Coca-Cola. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Michael.